Hello, everyone. We are so excited that you have chosen to join us for our wellness series. We are doing a session throughout the months of February, March, and April. And so our February series is really focused on boundaries. So looking at creating, communicating, and committing to your boundaries. And today's session, which is taking place on February 3rd, is focused on its boundaries for me, creating healthy, functional boundaries. I'm Dr. Jennifer Culver, one of your presenters, and with me is...
Hi, I'm Dr. Natalie Drozda. Happy to be here with you today. We're both coming to you from the Counseling and Development Department.
And so we're excited to share with you more about boundaries. At the end, we will have a link to a handout that you'll be able to use to really take in the information and begin to apply it and think through it. But right now, we're going to go ahead and jump in and share with you some information that we have related to the topic of boundaries.
Sounds good. Let me share my screen for y'all. All right, yes, that is who we are. Okay, so this is something that I found on social media. I'm not sure who to credit for it, but it's definitely not created by me. So this little piece says, "No," draws a circle around you with chalk and says, "I have given enough." And I think especially during this semester, it's important for us to recognize our energy levels and when it feels like, yes, we have indeed given enough for now.
So what exactly are boundaries? What is a boundary? For some of us, when we hear this word, boundaries have been something that maybe we've used and we have an understanding of it. For others, us, when we hear boundaries, sometimes there can be hesitation. Is it me being mean? How will people take my boundaries? And so it's important that we have a shared understanding of what a boundary is. And a boundary just indicates that there's a limit. It helps to communicate rules, standards, and expectations for how we interact with ourselves, how other people interact with us as well. So it really helps us understand what it means for engaging in relationships or activities with other people. And when we think about that, boundaries are not just for interpersonal relationships, but also for the intrapersonal relationship that we have with ourselves. There's different types of boundaries: physical, emotional, temporal, material, financial, spiritual. And so we'll talk more about that as we continue to progress throughout our time together today.
So those are an example of some different types of boundaries, and there can be an infinite type of boundaries, but a lot of them are encompassed in the ones listed there. So we'll give some examples of that. So physical boundaries are dealing with what is acceptable to you in your physical space, on your person. So something could be, as simple as, "No, I don't really feel like having a hug right now," having some sexual type boundaries for yourself as well. Emotional and mental boundaries can be sort of, do I have the emotional capacity to engage in a conversation with maybe a friend in need right now? It doesn't mean that you don't care, but it's assessing your own energy level and sort of emotional tank, regarding if you're able to provide and hold space for someone else in that moment. Temporal boundaries is just simply about your time. So maybe you try to stop doing schoolwork and homework at a certain time in the evening, but you have a deadline the next day and you're debating whether or not, okay, do I forgo some sleep for myself, or do I try to maybe, do it really quickly in the morning? Material and financial boundaries could deal with what you're willing to share with others. Financially, are you willing to lend money? Or maybe it's a boundary you set for yourself to not buy everything in your Amazon cart. And there's certainly some other ones as well. Did you want to add anything to that, Dr. Culver?
Yeah, some other things to consider are spiritual boundaries. So just thinking about, for you, what are your boundaries as it relates to dealing with various spiritual matters? Who are you willing to talk with about spiritual matters? The manner in which you feel comfortable talking about different things with spirituality, how you'd like people to respect or respond to your own spiritual practices and spiritual values. So that may be another area of boundaries as well. Also intellectual boundaries. So just thinking about when it comes to thoughts and ideas and information and dreams and hopes that you may have, what are the boundaries around how you communicate those, how you share those, but also how you respond to others, right? So really thinking about if someone has an idea that maybe is very different from your own experiences or your way of thinking, what are your boundaries that allow you to respect or communicate and share your own thoughts? So those are just some others. So again, when we think about the kind of categories of boundaries and types of boundaries, there's a wide range. But one of the things we're hoping you're walking away with is an understanding that when we think about boundaries, we have various categories, and those categories differ depending on the type of relationship, but you really want to take some time and think about, have you considered boundaries in all of these areas?
So we went over the different types of boundaries, but now we'll look at the different categories to kind of describe the boundaries. So there's a lot of different terms to describe boundaries, but these three get at the heart of kind of the characteristics of certain boundaries that you may have within yourself and in terms of your relationships with others around you. So we will give some examples too moving forward of what those can look like. That'll hopefully be helpful.
And also, as you're looking at this slide, just other terms that you may hear, especially when it comes to like flexible, you may hear things like healthy boundaries or functional boundaries. When it comes to diffuse, you may hear the word like porous boundaries or too loose boundaries, rigid, too tight. So we just want you to be aware of, as you are maybe looking at different information or having conversations, some of the other words that you may hear, but we'll be using these three words as we progress.
And we'll start with talking a little bit about rigid boundaries. So rigid sort of is just like it sounds. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of room for flexibility or adaptation. And there's probably some things in your life that it's good to have pretty rigid boundaries around, maybe some non-negotiables for yourself. But if all of your boundaries are rigid, they can potentially lead to some discomfort, and you might not be functioning in a way that feels relaxed to you. So this could look like, maybe not feeling comfortable allowing others to join your friend group. It might be something like maybe you yourself are uncomfortable with drinking and choose not to do that for yourself. And maybe your friend is having a birthday party at a restaurant where there is a bar. And, barring any danger, like let's say just for sake of argument that you're not in recovery or something and it wouldn't jeopardize that, maybe you refuse to go and celebrate your friend's birthday and, refuse to celebrate with them in maybe another way even. So it could also entail sort of leaving a situation or leaving a person before they could leave you as well. Yeah. Any other things you want to add?
Yeah, I just think for me, can be very visual. And so I think this picture is a great representation of those boundaries when they're rigid, right? So you see this description here, it's not getting anything in and not getting anything out. And so when we think about life, right, life is going to change and flow and different things are going to come at us. And when things are really rigid, right, they can't be penetrated, they can't be moved. Sometimes then when things hit us, we really move to a breaking point. And so rigid boundaries, when you think about some of the importance of being able to kind of withstand what comes along, rigid boundaries really kind of just stop, and they don't always withstand changes and things that may come up. So that's something to kind of be attentive to when we begin to think about looking at this picture and how it may impact how we move through life and be able to withstand changes that may emerge.
And this could be also, it might be helpful to reflect on rigid boundaries can be a self-protective measure that may serve you well in certain situations or may have developed for very good reasons, but it doesn't mean that it's serving you well presently. All right. Diffuse boundaries, kind of the opposite of rigid boundaries here. So too open, maybe it could entail saying yes when you want to say no. You might have difficulty making decisions or defer to other folks, even when you don't necessarily want to. And so this image here, I think, is a pretty good reflection of that. So chain link fences, air can move in and out. You can maybe even climb them if you wanted to, depending. So what does this look like? It could look like maybe responding to friends on Snap all hours of the night, even when you really want to go to bed. Someone's like, oh, come on, I'm having a really hard time. And instead of trying to maintain your sleep schedule for yourself, you make yourself available to other folks, and it's kind of based on their needs.
Yeah. And I think what you just mentioned, that piece is so key. Like, that it's based on other people's needs. And so sometimes when you have diffused boundaries, you also have a disconnection from what your needs are. So when you're having conversations and people are talking to you about, well, what's important to you? What do you really want? What do you like? A lot of times it may be difficult. You're like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know what's important to me. And that's because sometimes when those boundaries are diffused, because they're focused on meeting others' needs or putting other people's needs first, we sometimes are disconnected then from what our own needs may be.
I think another good example of this could be, maybe feeling pressured to go home every weekend to help out with family issues and things. And then that, as a result, maybe you have less and less, not only time for yourself, but time for your academics. And so you're starting each week, maybe feeling more pressured and rushed. I think that a lot of people kind of contend with that during the semester.
Absolutely. Could look like when hanging out with friends, just, hey, let's go off campus and get something to eat. What do you want? Oh, I don't know anything. And maybe going out to eat when you actually don't have the finances to pay for eating off campus, that you really need to just use the meal plan. But when those boundaries are diffused, you may just go along with that.
Great examples. All right. So this last one here is flexible, or you could say healthy boundaries as well. And I selected a read for this this boundary category, because it's sort of like reeds can adapt to their surroundings. They might bend a little bit in the wind, but they can come back up straight. They can withstand really harsh winds and maybe not snap and bend and break, and they'll adapt to the situation. So flexible boundaries can look like responding rather than reacting to situations in healthy ways. So this could be, allowing yourself to maybe work a little bit later into the evenings on occasions when maybe an emergency comes up, but in not allowing that then to become your the norm for you. So let's say an emergency situation comes up and you forgot that you had a project due the next day. Okay, well, maybe you might end up staying up a little bit later than normal, but then that doesn't end up completely shifting and rocking your world. It's a one-time thing that you can kind of then go back to an equilibrium that feels good to you.
Yeah. And when we think about like that equilibrium, we think about what feels good to you. These flexible boundaries are really based on your values, your needs, your capacity, your limits. And so the reason why they have that flexibility is because you're able to recognize in this situation, in this context, what is my need? And how do I set a boundary then that enables me to meet my need? It also allows you to say, what are my values, right? And how do I set a boundary or a limit or a rule that's consistent with my values, who I am, my personality? And because we also know that things can change, right? How we may view something or value something in one context may look different in another context. And so it allows us to adjust to context and how we may change and develop over time as an individual.
So it really does involve paying attention to yourself and evaluating and reevaluating your energy levels in a situation. So kind of going back to a prior example, let's say there's a friend that you have, a friend in need that's wanting support. And, in the previous example, maybe you didn't have the emotional capacity or the energy at the time to attend to them, but you did anyway and ended up feeling really depleted after. Flexible boundaries might look something like, okay, well, maybe I didn't plan to spend my evening at my friend's apartment, but I do have some energy left after the day. So I will go over for an hour and stick to that. So that could be an example as well.
Absolutely. And as we're talking a little bit about capacity, for me, it brings up like taking into account like who you are and assessing where you're at that time, it allows you to acknowledge your capability, right? I have the ability to help a friend, but at the same time, also take into account capacity. But do I have the capacity at this moment? Meaning, do I have the energy? Do I have the mental clarity? Do I have the financial resources? And so it takes into account both the capability as well as the capacity.
And it's also prioritizing your own needs. So not superimposing someone else's needs on top of yours. So you have the emotional energy and space to attend to a friend. That's wonderful, but you don't do that to your own detriment. Like you're not staying over until 4 a.m. if you don't want to.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So we have a little case scenario for you here. We won't necessarily spend time reading it to you, but we'd invite you to maybe pause the video and then see what type of boundaries are entailed in this and also what categories are involved as well. See if you can name that boundary.
So one of the things, now that we've talked with you about the different types of boundaries, the different categories of boundaries, we've given you some examples. One of the things we want to encourage you to engage in is self-reflection. We talked about one of the things with boundaries is being able to be self-aware of what is your capacity, what is your ability, what is your need. And so that requires you checking in with yourself, being mindful. And so we wanted to give you some questions to really reflect on to help you begin to think about where are your boundaries. And so really then what becomes important is being able to lean into and understand what is that uncomfortable edge for you? Where are you starting to feel uncomfortable, starting to feel as if maybe someone is infringing closer to what for you is a non-negotiable? Other things that are important then for you to pay attention to is your energy. What are those things that are energy and life-giving and you walk away feeling excited and energized? But what are those things or people or places where your energy is sucked out? You feel depleted, you feel deprived, you feel heavy and weighted down. Other things for you to pay attention to ask, to reflect on is when and where do you feel a lack of connection with individuals in your life? Where do you feel a lack of connection just in general in life? The other thing that you can begin to reflect on and think about is how do you deal with change? When circumstances change, when plans change, how do you deal with that? And then also really thinking about within different contexts, how do your boundaries differ? And so I would encourage you when we think about reflection, we all reflect in different ways. You might have some supportive people and trusting people in your life that you can actually talk about this conversation and bring up these questions. But prior to engaging in those conversations with others, it can also be helpful to just do personal reflection. So each of these could be a great journal entry or journal reflection, or just something for you to think about in general.
Even if it's just a bullet journal or something that you might take note of in your phone. I mean, one thing I was having a conversation about the other day was, if you receive a notification of a text from someone and your stomach drops, or do you feel compelled to respond to people right away? All of that takes time and energy, and it might not seem like it would be that much or that detrimental, but all of those little things that take your attention throughout the day, especially if it's something that you feel like you don't want to give attention to, that really does add up. So we invite you to reflect on what those energy suckers might be.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And to even use some of my own personal experiences, for me, one of the things I noticed and paid attention to is what are my experiences when I have my work email on my personal phone versus taking the time to intentionally stop and check an email. And so how that impacts my boundaries, how that impacts my energy. And so I made some changes around when and where I keep, for instance, work email on a personal phone or not.
That is a great example. I actually don't have notifications enabled on my phone for work emails for that very reason. I think everyone has had, and I do check it throughout the day. I think everyone has had that experience where a notification or something popping up, whether it's their phone or computer, completely breaks up their flow. And
Mm-hmm.
again, if that happens to you multiple times throughout the day, not only might you not be as focused on your academics, but it takes energy, and you have limited amounts of energy throughout the day, believe it or not, to get yourself back on track of what you actually are trying to pay attention to or would like to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So now, go ahead.
Go ahead. Signs that you might be struggling with some boundaries. So if you have engaged in some reflective practice already, maybe you already know some areas that don't feel so good to you, or you might have a few friendships that you feel like you're contributing too much of your energy to, and it doesn't really feel good to you. Here's some other signs and some things that you might want to pay attention to. If you feel like you have no time for yourself, if you find yourself being resentful of people around you, like you're giving too much of yourself, but you don't feel like you're getting enough back. If you feel like you have little or no control over your life or your schedule, or maybe on the more rigid side, you feel like you can't get close to people, like that might feel too scary or for some reason. If you feel like you can't say no, and that's super difficult, maybe you feel fearful when things change and you feel like it's hard to be flexible and kind of just adapt as the situation evolves throughout the day. And maybe you find yourself making other folks' problems your own at times. Maybe a friend always seems like there's some type of crisis or emergency going on with them, and then you kind of reroute your schedule and your orientation towards the day to attend to them. If you feel like you can't relax, that could be a super telling sign that you might be struggling with some boundaries in your life. And the last one's really important too. I think Dr. Culver had touched on it prior, was maybe having difficulty discerning, what are my own emotions or what are my own needs versus someone else's. Because that can be a super powerful exercise in really being honest with yourself and taking inventory of what is it that I want out of my time at Slippery Rock, what is it I want out of my life, and being sort of goal oriented and making sure that your boundaries and what's acceptable to you is in line with that.
Yeah. This is not an exhaustive list. There's other things that can indicate different struggles with boundaries, but I think this is a good list to start with, right? Reading through it and thinking about, are these some of the things that I've noticed in my own lived experiences? And then as you engage in that honest assessment, then really thinking through, okay, where might I need to do some more work around boundaries?
And what might I need to be curious about and open and willing to, maybe dealing with some of the initial discomfort of setting some boundaries. So then that way, in the long run, I'll feel more in control and relaxed about going about my day and things, because I know what's acceptable to me and what, yeah, exactly. Okay.
So we've really taken some time and talked about the different types of boundaries. We've last slide really talked about what might be some signs I'm struggling with boundaries. And so we really want to make sure that you have tools to dig in further related to this topic. And so some ways to do that can be through individual counseling sessions. So that can be counseling through the Student Counseling Center. And some of you who are watching this may already have a counseling relationship established. And so you can also work with your own current counselor. And so that's one way, individual counseling. In addition to individual counseling, you can also do this work using group counseling. And one of the things with group counseling is it gives you an opportunity to interact with other people. And as we're talking about boundaries, we know there's those internal boundaries, but also those external boundaries. So as you're learning about boundaries, you also have the ability with a group of other people to begin to practice communicating, setting, and implementing those boundaries, as well as discussing it, getting feedback. And so there's a healthy relationships group that really talks about and includes boundaries as part of that. So that may be an area for you where you want to further do the work around boundaries. In addition, at the Student Counseling Center, we have emergency walk-ins from 10 to 4 on Monday and Monday and Tuesday from 10 until 6:30. And then on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, that's going to be from 8 a.m. until 4:30 p.m. And so that might be a situation where you're really finding yourself in crisis, and that crisis may be connected to something with boundaries, but just in general, you need that emergency support because you're in crisis. That is something that's available. And we just want to make sure that as we're talking about boundaries, we make you aware of the resources that we offer through the Slippery Rock Student Counseling Center. But in addition, you might, after listening to this, feel like, this is really good. This psychoeducation, this information is helpful. I just want to learn more. And so we have our second series. We've talked about what are boundaries, but we also want to talk about how do you communicate boundaries? How do you begin to tell other people what your limits are? And so we'll be talking more specifically about that on February 10th. So that's a week from now, next Thursday. We're looking to be on campus in the Smith Student Center, room 319, at 12:30 during common hours. Should we find ourselves again in a situation where we're remote, then we will be doing another recorded session that you'll be able to watch. And then also the week after that, February 17th, we'll be talking about how to handle boundary violations. So you've set your boundaries, you've communicated your boundaries, but the person that you're in relationship with is not respecting your boundaries. They're violating them. So what do you do? What are options? But the other thing is, as you're walking away, you may be thinking, I really want to engage in these reflective practices. I want to think more about my boundaries. So we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to do that. So there is a QR code on your screen here. And so if you scan that, it will take you to a PDF handout where it will go through a wide variety of questions that will have you reflect on what are my current boundaries. It will have you look at who are the important people in my life and what type of boundaries do I have set with them. And then it will also have you think about what are some of the ways in which I can communicate these boundaries, and what are the ways in which I do currently communicate boundaries. So we hope that you will take an opportunity and look at that sheet, but also we would love to encourage you to also attend some more of our sessions coming up next week and the week following.
All right, so hopefully we covered a nice overview of boundary material for you today, and there's a wide breadth of information about boundaries, and we realize you still might have some questions. So if you are viewing this on February 3rd, this poll everywhere will be open for as long as it can be, but at least a day or two. So if you have any questions, please do submit it here, and then we will be addressing those during our next session.
Well, thank you so much for attending. We hope that this was helpful for you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next series.
Yes, thank you so much.